Good day, class. Welcome to my first lecture in international and regional organization subject. Okay, but for the purpose of clarifying the parameters of the course, I'd like to start my discussion on introducing or perhaps reviewing you of the different principles and basic ideas of public international law. I know and I'm aware that you are done with this subject last year as I look at your prospectus. But nevertheless, I really intended to start the discussion with this so that we will have a full and clearer grasp of uh, appreciating what IRO or what International Regional Organization all about. Okay, so this is introduction to public international law. Course, we have a traditional concept or definition of international law. These are body of rules and principles of action which are binding upon civilized states in their relations with one another. Okay, so usually international laws are actually products of treaties and executive agreements between states. Okay, sometimes these are um, created already as soon as the organization is created. So sometimes they give issuances, they produce issuances, protocols, okay, and perhaps in some conventions, okay, these are all products of this cooperation. So that's why it is being formulated into an international law. Okay. Now, what's the expanding scope of international law? It is the body of legal rules which apply between sovereign states and such other entities as have been granted international responsibility. Okay, so it is basic and it is noteworthy that once you enter into an international organization or a treaty or international agreement, automatically you have a responsibility to follow, you have an obligation to make. Okay, so you are duty bound to follow the rules, the policy, the principles of any organization or perhaps provisions of treaties and executive agreements. So you are being granted international responsibility as soon as you surrender a parcel of your sovereignty pursuant to the principle of um, auto-limitation. Okay, so what are the divisions of international law? We have, of course, laws of peace, laws of war, laws of neutrality. So when we say laws of peace, it refers or it governs the normal relations between states and also when war ends and peace is restored until another war. So later on, we will know that there are two classifications of creating an organization. Okay, those organizations which are created for a specific purpose, and there are also state organizations which are created for um, general purpose. Okay, so usually when we hear the word um, the ending of war, cessation of war, um, collective security, okay, or peace for the international community, you will always think of the United Nations. Okay, that's the very purpose of why it was created in the first place. Also, when we say loss of war, uh, it refers to an instance when war breaks out between or among some of them. The relations of these states are governed by laws of war for the duration of hostilities. In fact, we have the Geneva Conventions. Okay, we also have uh, we have rules on war. For example, you are not allowed to wear the uniform of your enemies, for example. Okay, so in international law, there's actually the different recent issuances, no? in relation to the Geneva Convention, which is still related um, in the laws of war. Okay. Also, we have laws of neutrality. Those states not involved in war continues to be regulated under the laws of peace in their relations inter se. However, the relations with belligerents or those involved in the war are governed by laws of neutrality. So here it is emphasized already because when we look at the history, okay, the First World War, there was initially a conflict between Austria-Hungary and Belgium. That was the initial uh, conflict between the parties which instigated the First World War. So we all know that um, a certain country right beside uh, Germany or German government, I think that was Sweden, not sure, or Tapat ni France. Now, there's a neutral country right there, and despite the status of being a neutral state, German government still, you know, insisted on attacking them. Okay, so that's also the reason why um, Great Britain or United Kingdom, okay, involved in that warfare in the First World War. Okay, anyway, so that's law of neutrality. Municipal law, okay, it refers to the national, domestic, or international law of the sovereign state defined in opposition to international law. For example, Philippine laws like the 1987 Constitution and the statutes, enactments of the Philippine Congress, kanang mga public acts. Okay, these are considered as municipal laws. There are also two views as to the appreciation of divisions of international law. We have the monists. They believe that in the oneness and unity of all law, there is an essential identity of the two spheres of law is that some of the fundamental notions of international law cannot be comprehended without assumption of a superior or legal order from which the various systems of municipal law are in a sense derived by way of delegation. Okay, so it in this view, okay, it believes that municipal law and international law are one and the same. Okay, while on the other hand, dualists they believe in the dichotomy of the law as that there are well-established differences between international law and municipal law. Dualists believe that separates the municipal law and the international law. In effect, they have different um, effect with respect to the enforcement, okay, of the rules, while monists believe that they're the same. They were living under the same, or were bound under the same unity of law. Okay. So what are the differences between municipal law and international law? For municipal law, it is issued by a political superior for the observance by those under its authority, while in international law, it is not imposed but simply adopted by states as a common rule of action among themselves. No? Again, we have two rules for that. We have the doctrine of transformation and the doctrine of incorporation. Municipal law consists mainly of enactments from lawmaking authority of each state. Okay, we have the legislative branch government, which is responsible for lawmaking or legislation. While international law is not derived from any particular legislation, but from such sources as international customs, international conventions, and the general principles of law. Municipal law regulates the relations of individuals among themselves or with their own state. So states between an accused, for example, okay, let's say people versus De La Cruz, okay, so that's an example. We also have for cases between private parties or Filipinos, for example, no, it's the municipal law that will apply. When we say international law, it refers to the relations inter se of states and other international persons. So when we say international persons, it may be a state actor or a non-state actor. When we say state actor, this refers to entities which, of course, acquire the four elements of the existence of a state. No? When we say non-state actors, this refers to different international organizations. Okay, so they are considered as non-state actors. Municipal law, in municipal law, violations of municipal law are addressed through local administrative and judicial process. So we have judicial department for that. Now that's in Article 8 of the Constitution. In international law naman, questions of international law are resolved through state-to-state transactions ranging from peaceful methods like negotiation, arbitration, to the hostile arbitrament of force like reprisals and even war. Okay, but war is, of course, as much as possible discouraged because in warfare there is no victorious party. Everyone is a loser. Okay, so here whenever there is a conflict between states, of course, we have mechanisms to resolve such conflicts. Now we have. I know you're familiar with the ICJ as one of the organs of the United Nations. We also have ICC. Okay, so later on we will know the differences between these two. Okay, they're not the same. They cater distinct and different types of cases. Okay. So for municipal law, as a general rule, it entails on the individual responsibility. Okay, so such as when you violate, for example, a law, then you will be responsible for that. If you either pay for a fine, you pay penalty, or you will be imprisoned by the state. In international law naman, responsibility for infractions of international law is usually collective in the sense that it attaches directly to the state and not to its national. So as far as United Nations are concerned, this responsibility is lodged within the United Nations Security Council, which is the most potent organ in the United Nations. Okay. Another thing is that in NATO, for example, NATO, okay, they have this agreement that an attack of one member state is considered to be an attack, of all the member states within the organization. Okay, so usually enforcement is very, very, very difficult in international politics. Enforcement is in reality not even possible. Okay, in international politics because, as I've said, um, it's it's the prerequisite there is whether or not the state have consented to that policy or not, or even if the state have consented, okay, you must also again ask for the consent of a particular country. Should you reprimand that particular entity? Okay. So in international law, you cannot imprison the state. You cannot uh, fine. You cannot fine it. You cannot impose death penalty whatsoever in case of violation or in case of disobedience with respect to the principles or aims and purposes of the organization. Okay, you cannot do that. What's the relation of public international law and municipal law? It is universally accepted postulate with or without an express declaration to such states admitted to the family of nations are bound by rules prescribed by it for the regulation of uh, international intercourse, inevitable consequence of membership in the international community. So once again that the states have been admitted to the family of nations, you are bound by that rules, no? But always remember that we always follow the two doctrines, no? The doctrine of transformation and the doctrine of transformation. Okay? International doesn't automatically apply in the Philippines or in the national sphere. Okay? Unless otherwise, of course, the law or the international law is considered as uh, generally accepted principle under Article 2, Section 2 of the 1987 Constitution. Otherwise, we apply the doctrine of transformation, which requires legislative action. Okay. So speaking of the doctrines, what do you mean by doctrine of incorporation? This is when states, being members of a family of nations, affirm the recognition of the principles of international law in their constitution. So, sir, paano ba nagiging generally accepted principle ang isang international law, no? So, once it attains its status of being a jus cogens, no? So, when we say jus cogens, it's already international customary law. So, when we say international customary law, you have to consider the time or the repeated acts or repeated practices of the states that they have been following that for years or for decades or for centuries. Okay, it's not automatic that for just 1 week, for example, as a member of the international community has been practicing something, okay, it will not automatically ripen into a international customary law. Okay, so it must, of course, we have to consider and we have to look at the rule or the policy in the international community based on the time or the period it has been repeatedly practiced or used. Okay. Now, in the case of U.S. versus Ginto, such principle is deemed incorporated in the law of every civilized state as a condition and consequence of its membership in the Society of Nations. This is embodied in our Constitution, the 1987 Constitution, Article 2, Section 2. The Philippines renounces war as an instrument of national policy, adopts the general accepted principles of international law as part of the law of the land, and adheres to the policy of peace, equality, justice, freedom, cooperation, and amity with all nations. Okay, this is what we have been discussing last week. Okay, so our basis for the doctrine of incorporation is Article 2, Section 2 of the 1987 Constitution. Okay, always remember that. So another feature of doctrine of incorporation is that there's no need of a legislative action. So you can automatically apply as long as it is considered as a generally accepted principle. Okay. So I'm sure you have read this case, the case of Coroda versus Halandoni. The issue is whether the Philippines has jurisdiction to try cases involving the violations of the Hague and Geneva Conventions because Philippines was not a signatory to the Hague and only signed the Geneva in 1947. What's the ruling? Yes, it has jurisdiction. The conventions form part of and are wholly based on the generally accepted principles of international law. So what's the catch there? So even if you are not a member or you are not a signatory, that is not an excuse because once a generally accepted principle of international law has ripened into the status of a jus cogens, which is an international customary law, okay, whether you are a signatory or not, you have to follow or you are duty bound to follow that international rule. Such rules and principles therefore form part of the law of our nation, even if the Philippines was not a signatory to the conventions embodying them. For our Constitution has been deliberately general and extensive in its scope and is not confined to the recognition of rules and principles of international law as contained in treaties to which our government may have been or shall be a signatory. Okay? All right. So doctrine of transformation, on the other hand, referred as the minority view, it holds that the generally accepted principles of international law are not per se binding upon the state, but must first be embodied in legislation enacted by the lawmaking body, and so transformed will become by binding upon the state as part of its municipal law. So again, if once you examine, for example, an international law, you have to classify first, is it a generally accepted principle or not? If it is not a generally accepted principle, what doctrine do you apply? You apply the doctrine of transformation, which means that it requires a legislative action. Okay? In the case of pharmaceutical healthcare versus Health Secretary Duque, it has been said that treaties become part of the law of the land through the process of transformation pursuant to this constitutional provision. Okay? In Article 7, Section 21, no treaty or international agreement shall be valid and effective unless concurred in by at least two-thirds of all the members of the Senate. What is an example of this? Example would be the Visiting Forces Agreement between the Philippines and United States. Okay, it's a treaty. So when we say it's a treaty, it requires legislative action from the Senate, which requires at least two-thirds of vote. Okay, here. In the case of Tanyada versus Angara, what's the pronouncement of the Supreme Court here? Philippine membership in the World Trade Organization is not an impairment of our sovereignty. Okay, this is due to the applicability of the doctrine of incorporation and pacta sunt servanda. Okay, the sovereignty of the Philippines is subject to restriction by its membership in the family of nations and the limitations imposed by treaty limitations. The Constitution did not envision our hermit-like isolation from the rest of the world. So in Tanyada versus Angara, it actually made a pronouncement that sovereignty of the state is not absolute. Okay, that the Supreme Court is telling us that once government enters into a treaty or join an international organization, it surrenders some of its sovereign power, okay, to that international organization. And it is duty bound to follow the rules and the principles of that organization. In this case, the World Trade. Okay? So therefore, its power as a state is subject to restriction upon its membership in the WTO. So conflict between public international law and municipal law, the basic rule would be to attempt to reconcile this apparent contradiction and thereby give effect, if possible, to both systems of law. Presumption is that municipal law is always enacted by each state with due regard for and never in defiance of the generally accepted principles of international law. But in reality, in case of conflict between the municipal law and the public international law, municipal law will always prevail. Okay? Because that's a manifestation of being a sovereign state, being a sovereign country. Right? Now, executive agreements and international agreements. Under Article 8, Section 4 of the Constitution, authorizes the Supreme Court the power to decide, all cases involving the constitutionality of treaty, international and executive agreements, which shall be heard en banc and decided with concurrence of majority of the members. So, what do you mean by en banc? When we say en banc, it has been decided by all the 15 justices, because the decision or manner of deciding cases in the Supreme Court could be two, no? It's whether en banc or in division, okay? So when I say division by three or by three or division of five, okay? But when you say en banc, all the justices of the Supreme Court, including the Chief Justice, will decide, will hear the case, okay, or the petition, so to speak. So what if there's someone who is challenging the constitutionality, of um, of a law or executive agreement or a treaty, then you go to the Supreme Court. Okay? So just like the case of the Philippines withdrawing, before the International Criminal Court, but there's actually a decision already by the Supreme Court with regard to that. No, what was the decision of the Supreme Court? That it was a valid withdrawal. Why? Because the president, as the head diplomat, of the Philippine government and the grand architect of the foreign policy, okay, it all has the discretion and the power to exercise what has been mandated by the Constitution. Okay? And that includes the withdrawal from organization, in this case, the Rome Statute or the ICC. What's the nature of executive agreement? That has been answered in the case of Sagisag versus Ochoa. The president has the power to enter into binding executive agreements without Senate concurrence. As sole organ of our foreign relations, the president is vested with the exclusive power to conduct and manage the country's interface with other states. So how did the Supreme Court define an executive agreement here? Executive agreements are defined as international agreements embodying adjustments of detail carrying out well-established national policies and traditions and those involving arrangements of a more or less temporary nature. In Bayan Muna versus Romulo, this court further clarified that executive agreements can cover a wide array of subjects that have various scopes and purposes. Treaties are formal documents which require ratification. So that's basically the difference between executive agreements and treaties. Treaties does require you to be approved by the 2/3 of the members of the Senate. Executive agreements become binding through executive action without need of a vote by the Senate or by Congress. However, this principle does not mean that domestic law distinguishes treaties, international agreements, and executive agreements is relegated to a mere variation in form, or that the constitutional requirement of Senate concurrence is demoted to an optional constitutional directive. There remain two very important features that distinguish treaties from executive agreements and translate them into terms of art in the domestic setting. So in the context of international law, there is actually no difference between executive agreement and treaties. But for purposes of Philippine law, okay, there's supposed to be distinction between the two because there is an explicit mandate under the Constitution that treaties require the vote of the legislative department. Okay. So here's the distinction. Executive agreements must remain traceable to an express or implied authorization under the Constitution, statutes, or treaties. The absence of these precedents puts the validity and effectivity of the executive agreements under serious question, for the main function of the exclusive executive is to enforce the Constitution and the laws enacted by the legislature, and not to be that they defeat or interfere in the performance of these rules. They cannot create new international obligations that are not expressly allowed or reasonably implied in the law they purport to implement. Treaties, on the other hand, by their very nature, are considered superior to executive agreements. Treaties are product of the executive and the Senate, unlike executive agreements, which are solely executive action. Because of the legislative participation of the Senate, a treaty is regarded as being on the same level as a statute. So what's the difference? Treaty, you cannot just undo yourself from entering into a treaty or an international agreement with an effect of a treaty, because if you want to dispatch yourself from this treaty, okay, you have to ask first the legislative department who at the outset agreed or approved the said agreement. Okay. So that's the difference between executive agreements and treaties. Okay, so now we can proceed with our discussion on the International Organization by Ian Herd. Okay, now we continue our discussion on the introduction to international organization. I'm sure I have uploaded the material for your reference on Google Classroom. So you just continue reading it, and maybe next week or 2 weeks from now, we can proceed with the organization formally. Okay, we'll start our discussion with the WTO, right? So this is introduction to international organizations. So what are international organizations? International organizations are created by the commitments made by sovereign states, and their purpose is to bind those states to their commitments. Okay, so if you join an organization, it's like an association in your village or in your subdivision, that once you submitted yourself in an association, you are bound to follow what's the rules, okay, be it internal or external, in that particular organization. Okay, so once you have submitted yourself, you have to follow the principles and rules or protocols in that entity. They are all intergovernmental entities established through a constitutional instrument such as treaty or agreement that provides each of them with its own decision-making powers that are distinct from those of its member states, as well as a jurisdiction, permanent structures, and the means of attaining a common goal and specific objectives on an international scale. Okay, so international politics is very complicated because at the outset, all states have different culture, all states have different beliefs, they have different practices. So it's very difficult to merge these diverse culture, diverse law, diverse language into one. But exactly why international organizations are there? Only for limited purpose. Okay, for perhaps for security, for collective peace, for economic activities, for trade activities. Okay, so these are some of the reasons why international organizations are established in the first place. Okay, but definitely international organizations are created for a purpose. Okay, take note also that an individual may not be a member of an international organization. Okay? As well as a corporation, di ba? Under our Philippine laws, no, our corporation enjoys, okay, a juridical capacity. But nevertheless, it has no right, okay, to become a member of an international organization. Even persons, because who are eligible to be members in the international organizations, those are states or it can be non-state actors. You know? Okay, so what are some of the unique purpose or programs of international organization? Let's take a look at the African Union. Okay, so Africa has been made significant progress in institutionalizing electoral democracy over the course of the past decade. This is reflected in a number of successful multi-party elections in most of EU member states. No, so actually in African Union they have this organ, the African Union Election Observation Missions. So every time a member state conducts election, they they how do you call this? They delegate some powers and they deploy people from African Union, you know, from AUEOM, okay, to go there to visit the precincts, okay, to go to the state who conducted the election. And their objectives are the following. to provide an accurate and impartial reporting or assessment of the election, including the degree to which the conduct of the elections meets regional, continental, and international standards for democratic elections. Uh, for me, personally, this is a gross violation, you know, of the principle of non-intervention under international law, because election, of course, we all know that it is a national concern. It is a national problem. Okay, it's a national issue, and we're not an international organization is not supposed to intervene with respect to these matters. Okay. Second is to offer recommendations for improvement of future elections based on the findings. No? So basically, they will evaluate you. How did you conduct, for example, your election, in let's say for example, in Uganda. Okay. Third, demonstrate the AU's interest to support AU member states, elections, and democratization process to ensure that the conduct of genuine elections contributes to the consolidation of democratic governance, peace, and stability. While it is true that the very purpose or objective of AU, as an organization is noble, okay, but we cannot really deny the fact that it goes beyond, or it went beyond encroaching the sovereignty, okay, sovereign existence of the member states. Also, EU adopts framework for sanctions on Lebanon to aid formation of the government. So, who are being sanctioned here? It is not actually the Lebanese government, no, but who are being sanctioned or threatened here? It's the politicians, of Lebanese government. Okay, those corrupt politicians are being threatened by European Union. Okay, so here are some noble intentions, noble objectives, or ideal objectives of different organizations. But sometimes it's very difficult to reconcile, in reality. How do we reconcile sovereign powers, okay, sovereign or your sovereignty as a state, okay, but from the power of different organizations to enforce its will, over your government. Here, as you can observe, these are all the internal problems. And if we follow the principle enunciated in the case of Uganda versus Congo, it's actually a gross violation, of the principle of non-intervention. Okay, but again, for as long as it is consented by the state, okay, there is no problem. Okay, for so long as the state consents. Okay, so here are the types of international organization. This is what I'm saying. Okay, we have to classify first what is the type of organization. Okay, because we have two classification, of organization. It may either be a task-specific organization or a general-purpose organization. So as to scope, task-specific organization cater few issue areas, while a general-purpose organization, of course, accepts many issues, or areas of concerns. Okay. Examples, tasks for task-specific organization or TSO, we have International Atomic Energy Agency. We also have IMF, World Bank, World Trade Organization. Okay, when we say IMF and World Bank, for IMF, of course, they provide loans for states, especially when the problem is caused by trade deficits, or problem on the trading, exporting, and importing of products. Okay, and due to that activity, too much importation, it costs you trade deficit. So you can go to IMF, you can seek refuge from IMF, and you can apply for a loan. For the World Bank naman, it's different. although it's the same with IMF insofar as granting loans, no, but the World Bank grant grants loans only when, for example, the purpose of the usage of that loan is to promote social services, to reduce poverty, for example, no. Another timely example would be the purchase of COVID-19 vaccines. Okay, so where did we get our fund? Of course, we got it from the World Bank and also from ADB, the Asian Development Bank. Okay, for the general purpose organizations, we have African Union, we have European Union, and United Nations. This is what I'm saying, you know, their purpose is general because they can cater issues like security, no, cyber security, no, which is very timely. Collective peace and security, what else? Economic activities, trading activities, okay? It is almost all encompassing. No? So that's the top classification that we need to understand. So what are the different organizations we are going or we will be discussing in this subject? We have World Trade Organization, we have International Monetary Fund, United Nations, World Bank, International Court of Justice, International Criminal Court, International Labor Organization, may European Union pa pala. Organization of American States, OAS. We also have African Union, and we also have Association of Southeast Asian Nations, or the ASEAN, of which we are a member. And just recently, last August 8th, we have celebrated the 54th founding anniversary of the ASEAN. Anyway, so each chapter from the book is structured around three key questions. First, what are the obligations that countries consent when they join the organization? Second, do states in practice comply with these obligations? And three, what powers of enforcement does the organization have? Now, this is the cycle of studying international politics. No? Unsa ba'y obligasyon once na mosulod ka sa isa ka organization sa international community? Dapat kani imuha ning i-uphold nimong democracy, i-uphold nimong justice, gender equality. Okay? So do states in practice comply with this obligation? So we have to check, we have to evaluate. Is it consistent? Is it the same portrayal of what has been the ideal rule in the international organization? So, for example, nag-death penalty ba ka diri sa imong estado niya sa imuhang gisaynan nga international agreement, ginabawal na siya, or you are discouraged to stop that, no, as a form of penalty, for example, no? Just like in Europe, no, in the European Union, almost, if not all, actually halos lahat, no, kanang states sa European Union, they do not impose death penalty, except for Belarus and Russia. Okay? And the third is what powers of enforcement. So assuming that a state, for example, state A doesn't follow, okay, the principles of the organization, then what's your enforcement strategy? What's your enforcement mechanism? So these are the questions that we need to deal into, no, as we go along with our discussion on the specific organizations, no. Unsa di ay dapat ang buhaton nimo? Okay? So yun na nga, you consent to the organization, then you delineate the principles, you have to follow the principles. In case of non-compliance with that principles, then what's your next step? Okay, what's your enforcement mechanism? So obligations. Obligations is, again, the bread and butter of international organizations. When governments join international organizations, they promise to accept whatever rules or obligations are included in these treaties. For instance, Philippine government, signatory to the United Nations. Okay, and one of the rules in the United Nations is that it discourages war. Okay, So how do we make that, or how do we get that principle? Okay, or in what manner are we going to show to the international community that we are complying with that policy in the United Nations? In fact, in the Constitution, we have Article 2, Section 2, the Philippines renounces war as an instrument of national policy. So always remember that the Philippines, or in the United Nations, we renounce war. Okay? So we prohibit aggressive war, but we allow defensive war. No? Alam nga naman kung i-invade na ka sa isa ka na, so di pa ka musukol. No? You have, in that case, you already have the obligation. You are already duty bound to accept and to retaliate because you have the duty to defend your territory. Okay? The activities of the organization are governed by the terms of the treaty, and the obligations of the members are defined by the commitments they made there. No? So depending on the organization you are joining into. For example, Philippines as a member of the ASEAN. Okay, so we have to, now the program in 2021 is gender equality. So that's why Philippine uh, legislative branch, no, headed by the chair of the committee, no, Risa Ontiveros, okay, have created bills, no, have passed bills in the Philippine Senate. Okay, and this is in line with or congruent to the principles enshrined in the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. And that's an example of that. Okay? Compliance. Okay? If you have an obligation, were you able to comply with that obligation? With a well-grounded understanding of the legal obligations of states, we can then consider why, when, and how well states comply with those obligations. There are two moments where state consent is explicit in and around international organization. First, at the moment of joining the organization. That's the first consent. Okay, mo-appeal ko aning organisasyon, no? Mo-appeal kong IPEC, Asia Pacific Economic Council. So, unsa ba akong mga obligations diri? Okay? Dapat walay nuclear weapon. You don't develop nuclear weapon. Bawal death penalty. Okay? Bawal discrimination. You should always uphold the rule of law. Bawal ang extrajudicial killings. Okay? These are the basic obligations that you need to follow. Second, at the point where states see the opportunity to follow or to violate its rules. So there's second consent. No? Kung ni-violate ka and what's the manner of your enforcement, you have to ask the state for its consent. Dili na siya automatic. Okay? So in the case of China, for example, China versus Philippines, in the arbitration case over the maritime dispute between two governments. What was the issue there? No? The claim of Philippines and the claim of China over the territories located within the exclusive economic zone of the Philippine government. No? If we follow international law, of course, definitely it will favor Philippine government. But Philippine Chinese government, on the other hand, does not they didn't recognize the authority of the arbitration court because according to them, there's no consent sa kanilang part. Okay? And that's the problem. No? So there are two consents involved. The moment you submit yourself to the international community or family of nations. Second is whether you will submit yourself also to the authority enforcing that international law. Enforcement with a well-grounded understanding of the legal obligation. Oh, sorry. Okay. So, what do you mean by enforcement? No, anyway. Okay, what do you mean by enforcement? It refers to the mechanism of the state. You know? So in case of consenting to the obligation, And in case of non-compliance, and when there is non-compliance and it was discovered, so mechanism is of course part of the policy. Okay, it is rare that international organizations are constituted in such a way that they can take effective enforcement action against states who fail to live up to their obligations. Okay, so the absence of direct enforcement power is often held up as evidence of irrelevance because it would also affect the image of the state. It will also destroy the reputation of the organization. You have no enforcement mechanism. Okay. So the absence of direct enforcement is the evidence of irrelevance or at least the marginal importance of international organization and a justification for paying little attention to the rules and decisions. So without threat or enforcement, in other words, class, why would states ever concede to international organizations when their interests point in the direction of violation? It is easy to dispense with this objection on empirical grounds. That is, it is easy to show that states do indeed often comply with international organization despite the lack of enforcement. Okay, so for example, the action of um, the United States, with respect to its invasion in Iraq. Okay? So despite the refusal of United Nations Security Council, the United States insisted and invaded Iraq. Okay? What is supposed to be the mechanism, the enforcement mechanism over these violations, gross violations, no? So sometimes you can say that international organizations are biased, okay? Because these organizations are being controlled by hegemonic states, by powerful states. Because if they want to do something, uh, they definitely can do it. But if there's something that needs to be done in an organization, but it doesn't fit their interest or it doesn't uh, fit the interest of their uh, friend of the states of which they have good relationship or friendly relationship, then they have the choice, okay, or perhaps the discretion not to do it, okay. And that's the problem also with international organizations, especially the United Nations, because to analyze it, okay, frankly, out of the 6 or 7 organs of the United Nations, only the Security Council has the power to enforce the rules. Okay? What can the General Assembly do is to merely discuss and to make recommendations, but it is still subject to the voting of the Security Council, which is composed of the P5, the permanent five, or also known as the Big Five. We have Russia, France, USA, China, and Great Britain. Okay? So enforcement is necessary in general. Why? Because again, it would affect the reputation of the, the organization itself. For example, most countries that lose a case at the International Court of Justice end up changing their policy. You know? This is actually an example of an evidence in which the organization is exercising its power indirectly, okay? Exercising of power beyond what has been delegated to the organization itself, okay? Because when you are being, for example, suspended, there is an order for the suspension of trades, it will threaten the state. So when a certain enforcement mechanism threatens the state, it will affect the behavior of the state. Okay? And when it affects the behavior of the state, what's the consequence? Perhaps it would prompt the state to change its policy. And changing the policy of the state is a gross violation of the principle of the principle of non-intervention. But in that case, the international organization is indirectly okay, exercising its power over the state to change its policy. Okay, you change the policy, otherwise we will enforce this one or that one. Okay. All right, now we proceed. Sovereignty and consent. What is state sovereignty? It's defined by the legal and normative framework that says states are the final authority over their territory and the people within it. Okay. If we define it based on the constitutional law, last, no, it is the uncontrollable authority. It is the absolute authority. Okay. But again, it was held in Peñada versus Angara. Okay. The Supreme Court said that state sovereignty is not absolute. No? Because the moment it enters into the family of nations, okay, it accepts restrictions over its exercise of sovereignty. Okay? So states are sovereign in the sense that they are not subject to any higher political or legal authority. So the principle of non-intervention, on the other hand, is a logical corollary of state sovereignty. The demand for international organizations arises due to the unavoidable interdependencies between states, and their utility is measured by their contribution to managing them. So it is also important to discuss globalization here. The concept of globalization, according to Steger, for example, according to Steger, it is actually a circumstance which makes barriers, or it compresses the world into one, meaning it eliminates or it diminishes trade barriers, territorial barriers, political barriers. Okay, because of globalization, it opens the international community to everyone. Okay, and this is due to the fact that there is an avoidable interdependency. What do you mean by interdependency? No? In layman's term, interdependency kanang na kay panginahanglan na others can provide for you. States interdependencies. It means that no matter how powerful you are as a nation, no powerful how economically and politically stable you are, you still have needs. You still have, for example, Japanese government, even if they are very, very rich, but they needed some imports. They needed to import agricultural products from other countries. And this is the very reason of why international organizations and treaties have come into place, because of the interdependencies. Okay. How can we engage into trading? How can we engage into exporting and importing products without friendly relationship? Okay. And friendly relationship leads to establishing organization. And establishing organization leads to creating protocols, creating policies, creating international rules, okay? Engaging into business, engaging into economic activities, which would, of course, benefit both sides, both parties, both or all of the members in that organization. Okay? So how important is consent and sovereignty? Because sovereignty, as we defined as the uncontrollable authority of the state. Okay. So consent is the key, okay, in surrendering some of this authority of the state. Because once the state consents, again, as we all know, it opens its government, or it opens its, of course, its authority. It gives restrictions, it imposes restrictions to the authority of the state. Okay? And that's the significance of consent insofar as sovereignty is concerned, right? Because states are understood to be the highest political and legal authorities in a modern state system, the rules of international law and of international organizations are always subordinate to the rights of the states. Of course, no, we already know that. Under the system of state sovereignty, states are free to withhold or to withdraw their consent to these rules as they see fit. Now, we have discussed that when they enter, they consent, and if they violate or if they fail to comply, of course, they also have the uh, consent is also a prerequisite for the enforcement of international rule in an international organization. So state consent is involved in international organizations at two distinct moments. First, states must choose whether to join the organization or not. When a state refuses to join an organization, it generally has no legal obligation to pay any attention to what it says, except, no, there is an exception for this, as we have discussed earlier. And the exception for this is those international customary law or jus cogens. When we say international customary law, despite the fact that you are not a member of an organization, okay, for as long as it is a generally accepted principle, you are bound to follow it. But if rule of law, no? That's a basic rule in international law, and we all know that it is a customary international law. Can you use that as a defense that you are not a member? Hence, you are not compelled to follow the that rule. Okay, of course not. Now we have settled that issue in the case of Halandoni versus Coruda. Second, after joining an international organization, states have a choice each time they are confronted with the need to comply or not comply with its rules. The need to consent means that states can choose to violate international rules, and they can also choose to make the rules not apply to them. Okay, so we have discussed that already. So when states choose to ignore the commitments they have made to international organizations, we expect the IOs to find some way to force them to change their policies and comply. No, so that's what I'm saying, an indirect way of exercising their power or enforcement power over the state. Failing to do that is generally seen as a sign of weakness or even a failure, in the organization. IOs are stuck in the position of trying to influence actors that have the legal right and perhaps also the political power to resist that influence. Okay, let's talk about global governance and international organizations. How do we define global governance? It refers to the broad range of rules and actors that make up the international regime on an issue. It's a capacious category with uncertain boundaries, and it could include many important international forces, actors, and rules. No, so again, it involves activities of the state. Okay, and as we all know, the behaviors of the states are different in international community. They really have distinct characters and behaviors, and these characters can change from time to time, can change from one state to another. It means that when the relationship of country A to country B, no? So the relationship of A to B could be different from the relationship of A to C. Okay, with the way how we treat U.S. government right now is different to what we how are we showing appreciation to the Chinese government. Okay, so it's very different. Okay, so we have to discuss theory, methods, and international organizations. No? Again, it's all in the book. International organizations shape the politics and controversies that arise among countries in a number of ways. They are sometimes powerful forces in their own right, as when international court decides that the state is violating its legal obligations, or when the UN sends peacekeepers to intervene in a conflict. These are actually found in the UN Charter. That once there is a threat to the security, no, of another member state, then the United Nations, through the Security Council, can actually enforce its will. But sometimes, again, in reality, okay, just like what happened in the Rwandan genocide, it's in Africa. Despite the fact that it's already clear and straightforward that the United Nations, through the Security Council, they really have to intervene, in that situation, in that genocide situation. But they didn't, no, and they themselves knew, no, of the reasons. Sila rin nakabalo, no. So despite the necessity, the urgency of the problem, they failed and they refuses to help. They refuses to enforce. Okay, maybe they do not have interest over these states, over these people, and over this country. Okay, because after all, they do not act if they do not have interest or they do not get in return. Okay. International organizations are diverse and sophisticated entities with legal, political, social dimensions that overlap and conflict in interesting ways. They vary widely in their substantive areas of authority, their internal structures, and their political salience. Okay, so again, we all know, that's given the diversity of the states. We have different legal framework, we have different political framework, and social dimensions. And that is why we always have different characters. States have thousands of characters, depending on the state they are engaging into. So, what are theories? In social science, set of ideas that simplifies the complexity of the world and gives suggestions for how to identify the key forces and actors within it. Okay, so here we will be talking about isms or theories in international organization. It is actually also applicable in the study of international relations. Okay, but we will briefly review them. But take note, and as a caveat, okay, when we study theories, you are not supposed to understand these differences or different theories as if they have competing definitions or they have competing purpose or aims in so far as understanding world politics. Okay? So what I want you to do is to appreciate these theories by broadening your understanding because it could widen your understanding of world politics, especially the behavior. By studying these theories, we can easily identify the type of theory which the state has been practicing. So again, through these theories, we will know and we can identify what is the ideology, okay, that they are focused into. What type of ideology this character shows. Okay, the character of United States, the character of Austria, the character of Mexico, for example. Okay, so let us not treat these theories as if they are competing from one another. Okay, rather we should appreciate these theories by widening our understanding of world politics and international politics. Okay, first, let's realism. Now, according to the realists, power is understood in terms of material, military resources such as tanks and bombs, and in the contribution of these to the power or security of a country. Realism is, realism is telling us that countries are insecure with one another. So that's why when, for example, a manifestation for that would be warfare, when they engage in war, and then, of course, those spearheaders of those who have created the organization are those victorious parties in the war. Okay? And basically, they're engaging into friendly relationship with other states. According to realism, is that they want to, of course, strengthen their powers, as an entity and as a country. It suggests that international politics should be understood in terms of the pursuit of military dominance by states in an effort to reduce their intrinsic sense of insecurity in relation to other countries. It is from this view of power that we can derive the central realist prediction that great powers will develop and mobilize military capabilities to constrain the most powerful among them. So this is the character of a hegemon, of a hegemonic state, that you are all doing this because you want to be the most powerful country. You'll be the most uh, efficient or politically stable, economically stable, and equipped in military equipments. And you want to be like that. You want to be that powerful country. Okay? And that's the belief of realism. Liberalism, it means the choices of states, but it can also refer to how domestic actors such as firms, leaders, and political parties make choices that shape the national interest at the international level. So it is lodged on the freedom of choice of the states whether to enter into organization or not. Okay. And of course, the purpose of this participation is in consideration of the interest of the national government. The distinctiveness of the liberal approach is in how this idea is put into practice in research. Liberalism suggests that IOs can be seen as a series of agreements which states enter into expecting to receive again. Mo man ang gina-suggest sa kaganina, okay, sa katong realism po. Okay? Here, it suggests that it is a series of agreements. So, at some point, really liberalism, in that point only, consistent or parallel to the belief of realism in that sense only. But liberalism acknowledges, or liberalists acknowledge, the fact that states have freedom, states have choice. Okay? States are the active agents, and even though they may agree to certain limits on their freedom as they consent to international rules, they remain legally and conceptually free to renounce those limits and revoke their consent at any time. Okay, what's an example of this? USA. They're one of those who established the Rome Statute, the International Criminal Court, and they are not even a member of that organization. They're not even a member of the International Criminal Court. That's why Digong is very mad at them. Now, you are prosecuting us, you are ordering us investigation, and you are not even a member to that organization, and you have been keeping releasing comments about the Philippine human rights violation, etc., etc., and you are not even a member. So that's the meat of their discussion, or the where they have conflict. So that's liberalism. When we say constructivism, the book really gave an illustration. This little example illustrates the two key features of constructivism. Actors behave toward the world around them in ways that are shaped by the ideas that they hold about the world. And that these ideas are generated by past interactions. Okay? Constructivism is founded on the fact that much of international politics is shaped by the ideas that people and states have about themselves and the world around them. Of course, we have the idea of ally and enemy, and that these ideas can change over time because, again, it definitely would influence the character and the behavior of the state in the international community. Now, if you're an ally, for example, okay, you would treat your ally positively. But for enemy, okay, of course, you do not treat your enemy with the same way how you treat your ally states. okay, or allied countries, and that these ideas can change over time. This is what makes the world hang together at the intersection between actors, ideas, and the material world. Another concrete example is when United States have been criticizing the North Korean government, in 1990, I think, 1990, the North Korean government, okay, developed their nuclear weapon, okay. So they have been criticizing it, okay. But in the year 2000, okay, Great Britain, the government of Britons, likewise developed its own nuclear weapon. Okay, and the United States has no say about it, or they didn't even comment about it. Okay, so you see the difference of character of the United States in that particular case. It is of course uh, influenced or founded on the fact whether that idea, you know, the idea that that country is your ally, and the idea that the other country is your enemy. So because of these ideas, it affects the behavior of states. It behaves or it influences the characters of the state. Marxism, this is your favorite modern political theorist. Anyway, the Marxist approach to international organizations begins from the premise that international politics and international economics are one singular system and that this system is inherently unequal. Remember from sa concept sa bourgeoisie, okay? This follows logically from the Marxist analysis of political economy, more generally which argues that there is no analytic separation between politics and economics. But uh, yun, because of the establishment of these international organizations, it likewise, uh, of course, it widens the gap between the rich and poor states or member states. Okay? Because according to Marxism, international organizations, those powerful countries, those rich countries, or first world countries have developed too much, but it deprives those third world countries from developing their own nations. Okay, so rather than lead to greater equality, Chimney suggests that the main global organizations such as the UN and the WTO and the IMF contribute to the maintaining existing divisions between rich and poor. Okay, and that's also if you try to analyze the action of United States towards, for example, Canada, the NAFTA. Okay? So by engaging or by signing into agreement with Canada, through NAFTA, okay, trade agreement, so it likewise extends its power over Mexico, which is a neighboring country of the United States. Okay? So who benefits more? It's the United States. Okay? That's why Marxism suggests that instead of achieving the purpose of being equal, in the international community, okay, the what is apparent now is that it's the otherwise, okay, because it widens the inequality, it widens the gap between those rich nations and poor nations, right? So example, unequal voting rules and membership of the UN Security Council. Okay? Si General Assembly, mag-discuss na sila. Mag-issue lang sila ng mga recommendations. But the decision-making power is lodged on the SC, Security Council. Second, WTO's efforts to reduce tariffs on third world exports such as textiles, but their inaction on reducing rich country subsidies on agriculture. Okay, so let's say uh, they would they would allow third world countries to export products at a reduced tariff. Siyempre, makatipid sila dito. Okay, because it benefits their nation. You know? And again, they needed third world countries to provide for them. Third, IMF's capacity to force countries to adopt market-based policies that harm the poor. Okay? So, uh, yun na nga, no? When they, for example, provide you loan. Okay? So, of course, a third world country, they adopt the market-based policies. It will only benefit those rich people. You know? And that's why Marxism is saying, Marxism or Marxists are telling us that it really do not cure the gap between the rich and poor. Rather, it widens and it only benefits those first world countries. Okay, so that concludes our discussion on the preliminary matters and the review on Republic International. Okay, I'll see you all next week. Thank you for listening and stay safe.